Hello, this is Miguel Conde, Senior History Major at Liberty University. I'm here with my mother, Kathleen Quinn York, to perform an oral history review. Mom, can you describe the history of our family with names, if you have them, as far back as you're aware?
Okay, certainly. On my mom's side, the names were Pancoast and Marks, and they were here in our country from the American Revolutionary times, because we know that because one of Mom's sister had joined the DAR, which is the Daughters of the American Revolution, and that organization requires you to have your lineage traced back as far as the American Revolution and someone that that fought in the war. I don't have the particulars on that, but the Pancoasts and the Marks, could be traced back as far as that. On the Irish side, on my dad's side, your grandfather's side, is the Quinn side. The names were Quinn and Coyne and Connolly, and the Irish came over circa 1860s, late 1860s, early 1870s, and their names, I told you their names already, so that's about it for that.
All right.
And they.
All right. The tradition of orally passing down history from ancestor to ancestor is extremely valuable. What is the oldest story regarding the history of our family that has been shared with you?
Well, we all have known that on my mother's father's side, the Carpenter side, that we had several people that fought in the Civil War, and that was, we don't know all the particulars except that we know that he fought on the northern side, and we did get the regiment name, and they did not lose their lives from what my mom said, that there was no life loss. They survived the war. So that's probably as far back. I never heard any of the revolutionary stories, but I just know that we were able to trace it back. Those stories somehow, I guess, got lost in the line.
Okay. If I remember correctly, the story that was shared was one of the family members in the Civil War lasted the entire war and was in his 40s. Is that correct?
Yes, that is.
Okay. Can you discuss the history of our ancestors that coming to the United States and where they settled when they came?
Well, on my mother's side, that was the German, English, Western Europe side. We think they settled in the Pittsburgh area. And in the Ohio, the western Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio area, and then on the Irish side, it was pretty much in the Pittsburgh area, the cities, the city area of Pittsburgh.
Okay. And what does our family oral history tell of the reasons why our ancestors came to the United States?
Well, I don't recall any reason that I know about the ones that were here during the Revolution. That was not, no one ever had stories of that. But on the Irish side, I used to hear that they were here because of the potato famine. Now, the potato famine, I believe, was a little bit earlier than the 1860s, but as a result, I guess, of the poor farming, and maybe, that was the reason that they came over, so we were all schooled on the potato famine idea of why they came.
Okay. Well, speaking of farming and agriculture has been an integral part of history. Are you aware of any history of agricultural way of life in our family?
Well, probably the only thing that I can remember is that my mom, and they had their own little, you couldn't really call it a farm, but it's what they were sustained on. My mom used to talk about canning and jarring and all summer when the vegetables came in, so that they would have food for the winter. They put potatoes in the cellar and turnips and various types of root vegetables in the cellar, so they would have them all year. And so that, and they had chickens, and they got eggs from their chickens, but that's, we didn't have any large-scale farming that I'm aware of.
Okay, but we did have sustenance farming. They were growing what they
consumed.
Yes.
Yeah, that would be, sustenance farming sounds like the right word for that.
All right. Our family has English Protestantism as well as Irish Catholicism in its history. These two cultures or religions have not had such an amicable history. Please discuss the interaction when those two backgrounds and religions met.
Okay, well, I have to say that I was aware that there was some Catholic prejudice. My mom used to say, being brought up, that there were common names in the town. The town that she grew up in Glassport, Pennsylvania, had a fairly large immigrant population, a fairly large Catholic immigrant population, and of course a possibly larger Protestant group. And she recalls that people would call the Catholics the Catlickers, and they pretty much had a derogatory name, or not necessarily a terribly derogatory name, but a not so nice name, like Hungarians were hunkies, Polish people were Polacks, and just in general, I think the Catholics were thought of as a backwards, cultish type of people, and probably more especially the Irish. The Irish were called Micks, and my mom did mention that it was not received very well when she married an Irish Catholic on the Protestant side. Now, on the Catholic side, she always spoke of an open arms, that the Catholic side, which could be just as prejudiced as the other side, did not object to their marriage.
Okay.
And I think there was, not that she wasn't aware of. The Catholics had names for the English too, like I think the John Bull name came from, which wasn't always, I don't think, necessarily a derogatory name, but it sort of was. The Irish had their, especially with English, anybody with English background, there's a long history of problems with the Irish and people from England.
All right. So culturally, how did the families interact?
They seem to interact very well. As Mom said, the Catholic side accepted the Protestants. There was, some meeting of the the Catholic side with the Protestants. And I know as a child growing up, when I would go to visit Grandma over the summer, I always went over to see the other grandma and aunts, the Catholic side, for at least 2 weeks as well. I might have spent 4 to 6 weeks with the extended family in the summer, and they always made sure that I got a couple weeks with my Catholic side.
Okay. Can you discuss our family history? What wars, what sides, male and female, and their participation?
Okay, well, we did mention the Civil War on Gramps' side. On my mother's father's side, we had people, fighting in the Civil War.
On what side were they fighting?
That would have been on my mother's father's side, and then on my mother's mother's side is where it goes back to the Revolution, the American Revolution. Then during the World Wars, there was mention in some of the documents that we have of people being registered for the draft, or registered for the military. I don't know if they called it the draft back then, in the early 1900s. But I know that we had a lot of, as soon as the war broke out, my mother's sister, my mother's little brother, my father, and his three brothers all signed up. In fact, two of the brothers lost their lives in the war, in World War II. But the others, lived through it and came home. And then, of course, on my mother's side, her sister and little brother were in the Navy, which was unusual. On the other side, on my father's side, they were in the Army, which was either the Army or at my father's time was called the Army Air Corps. He was, later on, an Air Force man, but that was, I guess, because the Air Force was part of the Army at that time. Excuse me. So anyway, so Aunt Lois actually, one of her Navy uniforms and her picture is in the Smithsonian as we speak. When my brother, your Uncle Rick, was doing some of the research, he came across some people that said they were looking for, WAC uniforms and stuff because there wasn't a whole lot of stuff about that, and so he actually got her picture and her uniform, and it's on display at the Smithsonian as we speak.
Terrific. And WAC is Women's Army Corps, correct?
Well, you know what? It wouldn't be WAC. It would have been WAVE. That's right, because it definitely was the Navy.
Okay.
It was not, and they had, so it would have been WAV, not WAC, yeah.
Okay. Now, you touched upon our family's participation in World War II. Your parents, my grandparents, have been said to have been a part of America's greatest generation. Much of this is due to their response and actions during the Second World War. Can you discuss our family's response to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and please include acts of both men and women?
Well, I think that my mom used to, talk about how they were on the radio and they heard President Roosevelt's, plea, and talking about, we've been bombed at Pearl Harbor. And I think for them it was kind of like for my generation when President Kennedy was shot, I can remember exactly where I was, or at 9/11. For her, that was, Pearl Harbor was something, a day that will live in infamy, as the president said on that announcement. And so they all, the four brothers on, my dad's side, and then Aunt Lois and Uncle Bob on my mom's side, and actually, there was a call during World War II to be, working in the factories, and I know, Mom worked in the factories, and we used to, kid her about being Rosie the Riveter. Now, I think in Glassport, where they lived, there was a glass house, and there was a steelworks, of course. So there was, that's where she went to work, in the steelworks. And I don't know particularly what she made, but, they poured steel and whatever was done there during the wartime.
Okay. You had mentioned that two of Grandfather Dan's brothers never returned from the war. What was how did their deaths impact family opinion on the war itself?
Well, it was interesting. I remember, my mom telling me that my father had an opportunity to come home, and so did Uncle Francis, who was the other surviving brother. But they both decided not to, because once you'd lost one family member, and I guess she said this was a law. Once you lost one son, your other sons didn't have to go to war. But all four were enlisted at the same time, and nobody wanted to come home. Now, it's not that my dad didn't want to come home. I remember, he was counting his missions, but he didn't use it as a reason to come home. They both stayed in, and my Uncle Francis was more on the backfield. He wasn't like out in absolute combat because he had really bad vision. So he was more of, he was over in Europe, but he wasn't in combat, where my father was in combat, flying, in planes and as a gunner and a photographer. But he did not, but he was counting his missions, because Mom remembered this story of he sent a letter home, and in those old days, they had a little Air Force insignia at the top of the letter, and anytime any letter was sent, she said it would be blacked through, because all the letters had to be looked at. You couldn't send anything back. And when they got the letter, she was there with her sisters and everything, and they were reading it, and up in the tiny corner of a wing, my father had written how many missions he'd done. And and they apparently that slipped through the blacking out of stuff, and it had my mom knew that he would be home soon because he had flown whatever 50 missions or 47 missions or whatever it was, and he was almost to the number that that he needed to be released back. So he was willing to do his duty, and he wasn't going to get out early, but he was anxious to get out, I think, too.
Okay. All family members have colorful members who were somewhat nefarious. It's my recollection that one of our extended family was involved in organized crime. Can you briefly discuss him and our
go ahead.
I said discuss him and our more law-abiding family's feelings and interactions regarding him.
Well, I got to meet Uncle Tom Coyne, who would have been, I think, the little brother of, with uncle to my father, so he would have been great uncle to me, and he was my grandmother's little brother. And I remember going with my older brother up to Pennsylvania. He lived in some kind of, like almost a kind of a mountainous resort community called Ligonier, and my dad was taking him. Apparently, Pennsylvania doesn't have miniature liquor bottles, so he was taking him a whole big couple cases of miniature liquor bottles. And before we got there, Dad told me that not to ask too many questions and to just be respectful and quiet. And we came there for dinner, and there were quite a few men there, and Uncle Tom's wife was there too, and it didn't seem anything different to us, but we were told not to ask questions. And then after we left, Dad said, "Did you see the tall man there? Blah 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 blah." And we all said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, he did time for Uncle Tom." And so my father never used the term mafia, but we always sort of figured that was our little black sheep mafia, Uncle Tom. And somebody, took the rap for him, and did that man there, I guess, so he looked after him after he got out of prison or whatever. So that was kind of funny. I didn't know much more about it, and neither did Mom, but that was, she did say, yeah, that was the story that I heard, too, about Uncle Tom. So he was in some kind of, scheme. I don't know what. Could have been liquor, could have been, who knows.
Okay. Now we've spoken.
But that's the only person I know of that had any criminal background, and I really don't know whether Mom's family knew about it. I sort of think that she might not have discussed that with them because that wouldn't have met with their approval. That would have kind of put us, the Irish side, back in the shanty Irish that they considered them to be anyway.
Okay. Now we've talked quite a bit about oral history. I'd like to speak a little bit about documentation. What type of documentation do we have? How far back does it go, and what type?
Well, we have lots of documentation of my father's history. We have his discharge papers. We have we've made contact with people that flew in the same Air Corps that he did. And Rick is really, my brother, your uncle, has really gotten quite a lot of documentation on that for us. I'm sure we have the stuff that my Aunt Lois did with the DAR, so we have some documentation. I wish I knew more about that, but I can't tell you much more about that. And of course, my aunts and uncles, all of their obituaries included the information about, where they were killed, how they were killed in action, and, various, things on that. So, we were able to uncover all their obituaries in the newspapers and stuff.
Okay. If you had to summarize our family